Just as Sherlock Holmes was a man ahead of his age in the 19th century, the detective has continuously been reinvented and modernized for contemporary audiences. Today, I'd like to take a closer look at Guy Ritchie's 2009 movie Sherlock Holmes and its 2011 sequel Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows. Ritchie's adaptations have become the very root of many modern-day ideas of who Sherlock Holmes is, not only causing a revival of adaptations of Doyle's works, but also reshaping Holmes into a new character accessible to all. Obviously, Guy Ritchie has not been the first to either adapt or reinvent the detective, thus observing the changes of Sherlock Holmes adaptations is worth taking a closer look at. Different creators' new stories featuring Sherlock Holmes have been around since the 19th century, so seemingly there has been a desire to use and rework the character ever since his inception. In a time when Sherlock Holmes had drifted into obscurity regarding his presence on screen, it was Guy Ritchie's 2009 movie that blew away the smoke and gave the detective new life. The literary Sherlock Holmes laid down the basics for the detective played by American actor Robert Downey Jr., whose own eccentricity seems to match that of Holmes. However, it will become quite obvious early on that Downey's Holmes is not necessarily Doyle's Holmes. The Sherlock Holmes of the 21st century is a man of action, oddness, and even romance, making him seem faithful to the original only on the surface. Guy Ritchie's movies focus on all the relationships important to Sherlock Holmes in order to make him a well-rounded character. However, the changes that have been made in order to accommodate the idea of a contemporary Sherlock Holmes will become evident when put opposite his literary origin. The relationships Holmes has in Ritchie's adaptations are meant to not only make Holmes a better man, but they actively seek to change his very character by turning Sherlock Holmes into a figure of romance. Holmes' relationships to female characters such as Irene Adler and others reminiscent of female clients in the stories have been knowingly romanticized, and even the detective's partnership with Dr. Watson takes on a level close to sexual intimacy, a notion that is even furthered by the very creators of the movies. By trying to make Sherlock Holmes more accessible to a modern-day audience, some of the most fundamental aspects of the literary character had to be changed or outright ignored. I'd like to show you how the contemporary aspect of Guy Ritchie's movie adaptations have romanticized the character of Sherlock Holmes and stripped him of his inherently eccentric, distinct and asexual nature. With this analysis, I'd like to take a closer look at Guy Ritchie's representation of one of the most famous literary characters. And with that said, I want to point out that I won't talk about the stories of each film, at least not too much. I'm more interested in a character-based analysis, since characterization is usually my primary interest when it comes to Sherlock Holmes adaptations. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on the Guy Ritchie films in more detail, leave me a comment down below and perhaps I'll make another analysis video at a later point in time. But for now, this introduction has been going on long enough, so let's get this essay going. The creators who seek to adapt Conan Doyle's adventures can roughly be divided into two camps. One, the interpreter aims at achieving the maximal correctness, trying to make every detail historically accurate and true to the literary source. Or two, the interpreter sees Conan Doyle's stories only as a starting point for their own imagination. Within those categories, one could open up many subgroups focusing on which characters are featuring, what the mystery specifically entails, and many other elements. In the end, the most essential ingredient to every Sherlock Holmes adaptation, regardless of being considered faithful or not, is the inclusion of the detective himself, whether by name or inspiration. Regarding the amount of times Sherlock Holmes has been adapted, it can become difficult to distinguish the quote-unquote real detective from the fictional one, since by now the idea of Sherlock Holmes has become far larger and now means far more than the letters of the text that inspired it. While for some who adapt Doyle's work, it is all about creating the perfect pastiche, a narrative that resembles and celebrates the original, others strive to have their own unique take on the great detective, trying to show him in the way they always envisioned him as. However, Sherlock Holmes purists, like myself if I'm being honest, can tend to become blind to anything remotely different from the books, even though the core issue of adapting Holmes is not so much how to follow the great Holmes of the past, but how to present an appealing yet reassuring picture of the eccentric genius who does not conform to social norm. This would also go hand in hand with the revival of Sherlock Holmes adaptations that have turned up in recent years, since many of them do not focus so much upon portraying Holmes historically accurate, but as an unusual and engaging character. Guy Ritchie's first adaptation, simply titled Sherlock Holmes, while being set in the 19th century, set up many of those contemporary ideas that came to influence later revisions such as Elementary or BBC's Sherlock. Enthusiasm for the detective had been dying down since the great portrayal by the late Jeremy Brett in the 1980s, and there were only occasional revivals like 2004's Sherlock Holmes in the case of the silk stocking. It was Guy Ritchie's 2009 movie that brought the detective back into the spotlight, since this time around he was going to star as a blockbuster action hero who was meant not only for the book lovers, but everyone who loves cinema. Ritchie reinvented Sherlock Holmes for a 21st century audience by presenting Holmes in a contemporary, action-packed tone to ensure broader accessibility. Also, the other creators of the movies, such as writer and former Warner's executive Lionel Wigram, saw the detective as someone different from previous, more classic portrayals. He's a man of action, and I felt a very modern character that kids of today could really relate to, both as a misfit and as a man who goes his own way. Thus, regarding our categories mentioned above, Guy Ritchie's adaptation was meant to celebrate Sherlock Holmes and Doyle's storytelling, heavily borrowing from the canon, but with a more modern and relatable touch to it all. Robert Downey Jr. would probably not have been the first choice for most people when it came to casting a new Sherlock Holmes. Apart from the fact that he's American, visually he doesn't really resemble the detective described in the books, though one has to give credit to Downey's physical capabilities in both films. In casting him, Guy Ritchie quite quickly made it obvious that this Sherlock Holmes was not going to be boring. With Downey's own experience as an action hero, the first movie was bound to be a rather adrenaline-inducing experience. Also, given Downey's rather flamboyant nature, which can basically be seen in almost any interview with the actor, he seems to be a perfect match for the eccentric consulting detective. However, while Guy Ritchie's movies clearly embrace Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's works, they also had to be constructed in a way that would be appealing for a wider mainstream audience. Sherlock Holmes has to stand out, but he still has to be relatable as well. Since Guy Ritchie takes the detective out of his usual smaller medium, Holmes is now on the big screen and operates on a far more heroic level than most TV shows, calling for action and adventure on a spectacular scale, romance, and of course, stuff blowing up. Turning Sherlock Holmes into the classic protagonist of a blockbuster movie automatically puts him in line with the many other leading men, the one whose quest throughout is both world-changing and personal. In order to achieve this rather stereotypical depiction of a hero, Guy Ritchie's films have noticeably toned down the many abnormal quirks surrounding Sherlock Holmes. Downey's detective is safely kept on the odd but charming side of the eccentricity spectrum. Rather than a cold, cunning thinking machine who could solve a case from his living room, Ritchie made Holmes a reckless risk-taker and thrill-seeker, devoid of the carefully sustained balance between asceticism and excess which defines the original. While the first movie still seems to make an effort to make Holmes's intelligence and deductions essential to the character by having him tell the viewer his conclusions, the second movie reduces this to a mere kind of foresight Holmes applies in combat.
Gone, but the lighter skin where it once sat suggests that you spent some time abroad wearing it proudly. That is, until you were informed of its true and rather modest worth, at which point you broke off the engagement and returned to England
Therein lies another shift, which seems to emphasize Holmes's physical strength over his mental capacities. In reducing Holmes's more collected yet calculating nature, which was most of the time enough he needed in order to get results, Ritchie's movies create a working frame for Sherlock Holmes that is ultimately deployed by any number of cinematic blockbuster hero faced with a supervillain. While Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock Holmes is intended to be as eccentric as his literary counterpart, the emotional and romantic outlines of the cinematic character are different to the original canon. In the movies, Holmes's aversion to anything regarding raw feelings, especially of a romantic nature, are more closely depicted as something the character has to overcome in order to be a better man. While he struggles to understand and accept Watson's desire for being in a loving marriage, Holmes's own emotional journey in the first movie is defined over a potential relationship with Irene Adler. Holmes is not complete as a person without someone special in his life. Since Guy Ritchie's movies fall into the category of classic blockbuster cinema, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that Holmes, as the main male character of the story, misses a romantic partner. I have an entire video essay explaining why the literary Holmes is not a man of romance and, in fact, asexual and aromantic, but Downey's detective would not be the classic relatable action hero if there was not a woman at his side. A favourite when it comes to love interest for the detective is the character of Irene Adler. Ritchie's movies are not different, and looking at the lack of other female characters in both the original canon and the particular adaptation we are examining, choosing Adler as a female lead seems like a safe and obvious choice. Thus, the questionable features of Sherlock Holmes' personality have been softened. He is given multiple storylines and relations in order to humanize him, and he has even been put into a romantic relationship that ignores the aspect of Holmes' original stand on romance, making Downey's detective simply a crowd pleaser that has become an action hero rather than the pioneer of a new, historically specific system for solving crime. Guy Ritchie's films, as many other adaptations before, do not even attempt to keep the relationship between Holmes and Adler one of mutual respect and no romantic or sexual connotations. The movies rather play with the popular will they won't they trope by turning Irene Adler into the one woman to ever touch Holmes' heart, but then got away. Downey's detective is utterly besotted with Adler, whose personal charms and duplicitous nature keep the detective off balance every time she appears, and thus Guy Ritchie has created a romantic subplot for an originally asexual and aromantic character. The makers of the first movie do not seem to have a problem with only using the aspects of Doyle's narrative that suit their own story. It quickly becomes obvious that this particular adaptation is willing in more than one way to either ignore or change original canon in order to create that sexual and romantic driven tension. In their first proper conversation, Irene Adler refers to the events of A Scandal in Bohemia by talking about the man she had married at the end of the story, but only to conclude that she has divorced him and can now proudly proclaim,
"I'm Irene Adler again."
This means that Guy Ritchie's movie deliberately annulled the events of Doyle's original story, in which Adler was happily married and Holmes had accepted the defeat at the hands of a woman, not only bringing Irene back, but also making her available so she can serve as a love interest. During the same conversation, there are also more implications regarding the events of A Scandal in Bohemia, such as when Irene says,
"Let's not dwell on the past."
This line is, as you can see, followed by an almost longing gaze from Holmes, implying that there might have been more to their original encounter than meets the eye. This idea is even highlighted shortly after, when Irene makes her way out and gives Holmes the address of the hotel she's staying at.
"Do you remember the grant? They gave me our old room."
Now, if you take a look at A Scandal in Bohemia, there is no mention of a grand hotel, nor is it ever mentioned that Holmes and Adler spent elaborate times alone together, either during or after the event of said story. In what she's saying, Irene seems to imply that there maybe once was a period when the two of them shared the intimacy of a hotel room together, and the viewer is left to their own devices to think up the rest. Aside from the changes regarding their literary origin story, the movie also makes it rather obvious from the very beginning that Irene Adler is supposed to be someone the audience is meant to see as a potential romantic partner for Holmes, given the fact that the detective's demeanor immediately changes the minute she enters a scene. This already begins with Adler winking at Holmes during a match, throwing him off so much he wants to call off the fight.
That's it, big man. Congratulations.
So even before the viewer properly encounters Irene Adler as a character, they are already aware of a female presence in this movie that seems to stir Holmes on an unusual level. When the two of them share their first proper scene together, the identity of Adler is deliberately kept secret. We can only see a close-up of Holmes waking up to her presence, her hands cracking nuts and the outer frames of her elaborate dress, emphasizing her importance as a character since the viewer is meant to anticipate her reveal. Holmes' change in attitude becomes evident when he hears her voice, and realizing who's in the room with him, wakes up alerted and immediately listens to her intently. Holmes and Adler clearly share a sense of familiarity throughout the scene. We can even see the photograph Holmes has asked the King of Bohemia for. However, he does not seem to want her to notice it. Thus Holmes rather clumsily tries to hide the photograph, possibly because he does not want Irene to know that he has kept any sort of sentiment for her after their initial encounter. Following this first conversation, which established the history and emotional connection of Holmes and Adler, the next scene, set in the Grand Hotel, raises the intimacy to a physical level. Adler opens Holmes the door while only wearing a towel. Holmes, even though he pretends not to care, is clearly startled and affected by her nakedness and follows her with his eyes as she turns her back on him and disrobes. Everything about Adler's demeanor and physicality in this scene tries to insinuate a sexual connection between her and Holmes, as she attempts to rekindle those romantic feelings they once seemed to have shared. She does so by suggesting,
Come with me.
and judging from Holmes's expression, we can see he actually seems to consider it for a moment. After declining her offer, Holmes drinks from a wine Adler had offered him, and it quickly becomes clear that she has drugged it. The following moments are somewhat questionable because Holmes is in a delirious state as he's about to faint. However, he does somewhat maintain a sense of control over his words and actions for a couple of seconds, which makes this whole scene a little hard to judge. Seeing Holmes having taken the drug, Irene holds him close, even sitting on his lap, embracing him as she goes on to reveal how much she does indeed care for him and would want him in her life.
Why couldn't you just come away with me?
Again, Holmes declines, and Adler, almost as an argument to convince him otherwise, kisses him passionately. Now, Holmes does not resist or fight back in any way, however, one must consider the influence of the drug. While one might argue that this would, in the most objective sense, be an act of sexual assault from Irene's side, the movie does not portray it as such. In fact, the tension between Holmes and Adler has been built up throughout the entire story, and given the physical intimacy of the scene, it only seems like the logical conclusion to let it culminate in a kiss between the male and female lead. With 5 seconds, yes, I timed that, it is also the longest kiss within the movie, and the audience is clearly meant to see this as a final romantic shift within Holmes and Adler's relationship. While movie Adler, true to her canon counterpart, has been established as a woman able to defend herself and outsmart even the great detective, Guy Ritchie can't help himself but to fall into some classic blockbuster patterns when it comes to female leads and love interests. Despite all her confidence, each time she gains the upper hand involves brute force, and sometimes that force is not applied by her own hand, but by those of male protectors. The first movie features a life-threatening situation for Adler from which Holmes has to save her. Holmes shows how protective he is of her, being the one who puts himself in close physical proximity to her despite the danger. As soon as she is in safety, Watson makes a deliberate exit, sensing that the two of them want to be alone, and indeed Adler proceeds to embrace and kiss Holmes, who seems to be a little embarrassed. Holmes helps her again, and only seconds later, when an explosion occurs, and the scene ends with the two of them holding onto each other, surrounded by fire. This brings us to the climax of the movie, which has Holmes, Watson, and Adler fighting thugs, defuse a dangerous mechanism, and face Lord Blackwood, the antagonist of the story. Even here, we have a clear indication of which relationship the audience is meant to focus on in regards to Holmes' character arc, because the climax revolves around a shared moment between him and Adler before they are interrupted by Lord Blackwood. Adler has tried to fled the scene, and upon realizing that she cannot go any further, and Holmes having cornered her, there occurs a final desperate moment between the two. Their relationship, more so than before, is still in the balance, and now it is time for both of them to make a last decision. Holmes, who seems to realize that his relationship with Adler is more than unconventional, says,
Run off. I won't be chasing you anymore. Fare thee well.
Though it has to be noted that he does not face her in that moment, and also his tone of voice, I think, and expressions seem as if he doesn't want her to know that he might feel differently. However, Adler herself seems reluctant to just leave it at that, deciding to mend their connection as she tells him,
I don't want to run anymore. I'll tell you everything.
And in this very moment, the little heart-to-heart is interrupted by a furious Lord Blackwood, who, despite Holmes' silent plea, pushes Adler off the tower bridge, and the detective is overcome by a wave of emotions, resulting in him attacking Blackwood. Following the aftermath of said fight, Holmes finds Irene, alive, on a scaffolding platform. Despite handcuffing her, their final scene is a solemn moment as they both look out over London and share their last sentiments for one another. Irene goes on to tell him about the existence of Moriarty and how he was able to manipulate her weak point. Even though he seems to guess what she is saying, Holmes still asks,
What was it, precisely?
Irene remains silent here, and it becomes even more evident what the implication is meant to be. Said implication will be examined further in this section, but for now it is suffice to say that the viewer in this last moment, albeit silently, receives a confirmation of Irene's love for Holmes. In the last minute on screen together, the framing of the characters also alludes to the romantic connection between the two. Holmes and Adler are constantly framed in close proximity to one another, and while they are talking, Adler very evidently even leans closer to Holmes as if expecting a kiss. However, Holmes simply gives her the key for the handcuffs and gets up. Knowing he's trying one last time to hide his feelings for her, Irene meaningfully smiles and says,
You'll miss me, Sherlock.
There is a certain sense of significance to this line, because for the first and only time, the audience hears Holmes' first name as an address for the detective. No other character, not even Watson, ever calls Holmes by his first name in these movies, and this privilege is reserved for Irene Adler, creating another moment of subtle but emotional intimacy between the two characters. Upon hearing Irene's final words, Holmes turns around and one final time says,
Sadly, yes.
and with this final kiss he gives her on the cheek, it is an obvious display of affection which concludes Holmes' emotional arc. While Holmes and Adler seem a little reluctant to fully commit to the romantic nature of their relationship, the other characters fully acknowledge and call out the feelings between the two of them. As mentioned earlier, Irene admits that Moriarty was using her in order to get to Holmes. The detective's arch-nemesis does not hire Irene because of her adventurous background, but purely for the emotional leverage she has on Holmes.
Well done, Miss Adler. That's precisely why I hired you.
Nevertheless, out of all the other characters, it is interestingly enough Watson who very openly calls out and even mocks Holmes' affections.
Look at you. Why is the only woman you've ever cared about a world-class criminal? Are you a masochist?
Holmes obviously dislikes his demeanour, but he does not negate Watson's words, but instead he just tries to ignore them. However, Watson, unlike Holmes for once, has a complete grasp of the picture and blatantly goes on to point out that Holmes, as the audience also sees throughout the movie, would go out of his way to accommodate Irene's wishes and well-being.
Possibly need.
Doesn't matter.
Alibi? A beard? A human canoe? She could sit on your back and paddle you up the Thames.
Irene Adler returns in Ritchie's sequel Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, even though her appearance is comparably brief in the second installment. However, this does neither diminish the romantic undertone of her and Holmes' relationship, nor her importance within the story and character development. In fact, it is the two of them who we first encounter as the movie picks up after a short introduction. There doesn't even seem to be any sense of pretend anymore, since we encounter Adler and Holmes as they walk arm in arm pretending to be a couple. They call each other by their first names and eventually agree on going out on a dinner date together later that day, before Irene leaves him in the company of thugs. Obviously, Holmes easily escapes them and follows Irene, who he finds talking to a businessman. He has no problem with acting as her husband, greeting her and giving her a kiss on the cheek. While he seemingly does the latter in order to obtain a letter from her, there continues to be a certain sense of romantic tension between the two characters. They are continuously framed in close proximity to one another, and they both seem rather excited in each other's company, despite them being in a dangerous situation, and it all eventually culminates in an eager kiss. Thus, the movie, in its earliest minutes, goes out of its way to remind the viewer of the previous film's romance and point out the emotional significance of Irene Adler for Holmes' character. We later see Holmes waiting for Adler for their dinner date, however the woman has, unfortunately, found her death at the hands of Moriarty. She's seen talking to the professor who, just as in the previous movie, acknowledges the romance as he says,
"It's been apparent to me for some time that you had succumbed to your feelings for him."
Then he goes on to eliminate Irene as a player in his game. Holmes does not learn of her death until much later when he meets Moriarty properly for the first time. While Moriarty tells Holmes that he will not accept the detective's wish to leave Watson alone, it is not necessarily this, but the moment Moriarty lets him know that Adler has died by getting out her bloody handkerchief, that puts Holmes visibly into a state of distress. As he has to force himself to keep his composure, Holmes takes Adler's handkerchief and ensures Moriarty.
I'm afraid you'd lose.
Her handkerchief turns up once more later when Watson finds it in Holmes' luggage and realizes the detective has suffered a great loss. Holmes can be seen sadly taking a tissue, sniffing it carefully before he throws it away. Clearly, the death of Irene Adler is treated as a major tragic event for Holmes, who we see in an unusual state of deep emotion whenever he's confronted with the absence of the woman. Irene becomes a victim to the trope of women in refrigerators, in which a female character is killed to further a male character's journey. In the end, Irene Adler is reduced to being the main character's love interest, so Holmes does not seem too machine-like and appears more relatable to the audience. Eventually, Irene has to die in order for Holmes to not only have emotional baggage in the second movie, but also so he can have another potential romantic partner in the form of Madame Simsa, leaving Irene Adler as a mere stereotypical narrative device than the defining character she was in the canon. Now, moving away from what the viewer is told on screen, let's move on to the people behind the scenes. When watching some of the interviews that went with the production of Guy Ritchie's first movie, there is no hiding of any subtlety anymore when it comes to the nature of Holmes and Adler's relationship. While the original detective from the canon can confidently be ascribed to the asexual or aromantic spectrum, the man himself, Robert Downey Jr., doesn't see Sherlock Holmes as such. He acknowledges Holmes' more eccentric nature, but then also says,
"He's a weirdo. He's not asexual. It just seems like he says to Watson, the fair sex is your department."
So he virtually eradicates this part of Holmes' identity for his own portrayal of the detective. Now, obviously, we cannot make any judgments regarding Downey's knowledge about asexuality or sexuality studies in general, but having him state that about Holmes clearly makes a point as to the interpretation of the character in this particular adaptation. Arguably, asexuality is not very well known in the common minds of society, given the fact that our culture tends to tell us that romance and sex go hand in hand and are required in order to lead a happy life. Downey himself furthers his argument, saying about Holmes,
I think he's too aware of the fact that it's an investment and that he has sacrificed his potential enjoyment in said realm for a higher cause.
Lionel Wigram, producer and writer of both Guy Ritchie movies, does acknowledge that Holmes is, quote-unquote, not that interested in women. However, he undermines this notion just a second later.
Sherlock Holmes, he's not that interested in women, at least on the surface.
Those last words clearly leave open the popular idea that Holmes, to a certain degree, only feigns his cold-heartedness, but would indulge in romance if he were to meet the right person. In this case, the person in question is Irene Adler, who, according to Wigram,
it seemed logical to bring Irene back. They met once in Scandal in Bohemia. I would suggest that maybe they met again. She broke his heart, and now they meet again.
So clearly there is no question regarding the actors and makers of the movie when it comes to the interpretation of the relationship between Holmes and Adler, as it has clearly been taken as a romantic and, to a certain degree, sexual relation from the very beginning. The female presence in Doyle's detective stories is rather sparse, and with Irene Adler having already been used as a female lead in Guy Ritchie's first movie, the second adaptation, Sherlock Holmes in Game of Shadows, comes up with its very own leading lady in the form of Madame Simsa, played by Naomi Rapace. Interesting enough, there is still Mary Morstan, Watson's wife. However, she is quickly sidelined in both movies and put in a position in which her character is of no greater importance to the story. Therefore, A Game of Shadows turns the character of Madame Simsa in the de facto stand-in for all other female clients and other less significant women from the original canon. Following the death of Irene Adler, the movie quickly introduces Madame Simsa as a new leading lady character. She gets involved in Holmes' investigation and becomes the third main character of the movie, basically taking up the role Irene has had in the first installment. Simsa virtually turns into the new apparent romantic partner for Sherlock Holmes, and while the relationship is not depicted as obviously romantic as the one with Adler, it is still interesting to know that she seems to be the woman's replacement. This means that the second movie had to kill off Irene Adler in order to not only have another main female character, but also a new potential love interest for Sherlock Holmes. Similar to a James Bond routine, the producer Joel Silver explained that the character of Simsa, we always intended to have a different kind of girl for each movie. Simsa is a gypsy, who the viewer encounters during Watson's stag party at an establishment in which she works as a fortune teller. Holmes was looking for her because he found a letter addressed to her, guessing she must be involved in Moriarty's plans in some way. She becomes his quasi-client so Holmes can find her brother and the connection between him and Moriarty. While she becomes Holmes and Watson's most important asset and contact person, she's not without any skills herself. Simsa is capable of defending herself, makes determined decisions, and is brave enough to destroy Moriarty's plans in order to find her brother. In that regard, her characteristics, in terms of being a leading lady in a 19th century story, could be described as being in line with our 21st century perception of strong female leads, the ones who try to defy gender stereotypes while not letting the women become caricatures. As previously mentioned, Madame Simsa is the quasi-replacement of Irene Adler. Adler dies in the introductory minutes of the movie, which are quite quickly followed by Watson's stag party, where we meet Simsa. While at this point Holmes himself does not know about Irene's death yet, the audience is already aware of her fate and thus can now focus on Madame Simsa, whose importance is emphasized by the fact that we know that Holmes is actively looking for her. The harmony between the two of them becomes evidently early on too, since Holmes impresses her with his own knowledge of card reading and then proceeds to rescue her from an intruder who they eventually defeat together. So not only do they share emotional chemistry right off the bat, but physical one as well, establishing a positive connection for both the characters and the audience quite quickly. Madame Simsa, when she isn't worried about her brother, is mostly defined by her relationship to Sherlock Holmes. With him she shares most, if not even all, of her screen time, since he is portrayed as the only one who can help her. Therefore, her connection to Holmes becomes inevitably deeper as the movie continues. The aforementioned introductory scene for Simsa has the two of them already sharing a positive dynamic, and even when Holmes and Watson find her again on the continent, they confide in her and she becomes a valuable asset for their further investigation. There clearly seems to be an unspoken trust and also a certain sense of respect between Holmes and Madame Simsa, given the fact that the detective willingly includes someone in his plans, which he would most likely not do if he did not think her capable enough. The detective has to rely on her knowledge of the country and the connections she and or her brother have to Moriarty's network. She also serves as Holmes and Watson's backup, being the one who saves them from almost certain death after facing Moriarty and his thugs in a weapons factory. During their escape, Holmes is seriously injured and on the brink of death. While Watson is attending to his wounds, it is Simsa who is physically closest to him, holding his head in her lap and singing to him. The emotional support here is obvious, and it's also Madame Simsa who notices first that Holmes eventually stops breathing. Believing him to be dead, she is visibly emotionally stunned, but still steps in to calm down an infuriated Watson. Luckily, however, Watson manages to bring Holmes back to life, which obviously relieves both him and also Madame Simsa. The finale of the movie brings the main characters to an important summit in Switzerland. While all of them wait for an opportunity to act, Holmes insists on dancing and offers Madame Simsa his hand. As they dance, they are not only in close physical proximity to one another, but also share intimate gazes, and Holmes, rather seriously, explains his skills of perception to her.
What do you see?
Everything. That is my curse.
This dancing sequence becomes even more significant if compared to the following dance between Holmes and Watson. While Holmes simply says,
38 minutes. In which case, we might as well dance.
before taking Simsa's hand and sharing an intimate moment. The second he asks Watson to dance, his offer is humorously commented upon with the words,
I thought you'd never ask.
So one ought to note that the dance between Holmes and the female lead is treated as something much more emotional and serious compared to Holmes's dance with another man, who is also his best friend, which goes to show as to where the movie puts the emotional significance. Given the fact that dancing is often seen as something romantic too, the rather serious manner and intense looks which accompany Holmes and Simsa's dance only emphasize, once again, a more romantic nature between the detective and the female lead of the movie. Loyal to the spirit of the original stories, the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson remains the most important ingredient of Guy Ritchie's adaptations. Those two characters share most of their screen time with each other, and either of them is constantly linked to the other. Whereas the women in Guy Ritchie's movies also emphasize the human side of Holmes, showing he is capable and in need of love too, Watson's role remains as being the one who grounds the detective, just as he is virtually the only person to do so in the canon. At the core of Ritchie's movies does not necessarily lie the mystery and the drama, it is the bond shared by Holmes and Watson who adventure together despite the dangers of their occasional disagreements. Guy Ritchie's first movie depicts the two men as already having lived and worked together for many years. They function as a team, naturally relying on one another even when separated, and this trust becomes clear in their very first appearance together, in which they both take down a thug at the same time without a word of verbal communication. How used they are to one another at this point is further emphasized by Watson's relative mild surprise to Holmes' eccentricities. For example, when he fires a gun in their flat and the doctor is quickly moving on to reading the multiple case office so Holmes can get to work. In line with the canon, Watson also sees himself not only as Holmes' friend, but also as the one caring for his health, which is made clear when he implores Holmes with the words,
Holmes, as your doctor,
He'll be straight as a trivet in no time.
as your friend.
They clearly value each other's company, skills, and opinions, and Guy Ritchie's adaptation manages to show that not only Watson admires Holmes, but also vice versa. Holmes appeals to Watson in a strained time of their friendship with the words,
Watson, you have the grand gift of silence. Makes you quite invaluable as a companion.
The movie also once more highlights that while Holmes tends to be the smarter one of the two, Watson is not without his own knowledge. For example, when the two men find a mysterious watch, they examine it together with Watson leading the deduction, and that ultimately prompts Holmes to compliment his friend.
Likely a drunk. Every time he wound the watch, his hand would slip, hence the scratches.
Yes. Very good, Watson. You've developed considerable deductive powers of your own.
It is also worth noting here that Holmes gives Watson that particular moment to shine because it becomes clear by the end of their conversation that Holmes had already made the same deductions a while ago. Their literary counterparts have basically no doubt when it comes to the bond they share. While Guy Ritchie's Holmes and Watson do share a sense of trust, there are also multiple moments of disagreement and even outright dislike to a certain degree. However, just as their fictional equals, Robert Downey Jr.'s Holmes and Jude Law's Watson look after one another in all parts of their lives. For example, despite Watson's initial reluctance, he goes on to follow Holmes into a dingy-looking house because he knows it might be dangerous. In Doyle's work, it is Watson who manages to be the only person Sherlock Holmes allows himself to be emotional with or for. Guy Ritchie's adaptation gives Holmes multiple intimate relationships in the form of Irene Adler, Madame Simsa, and Dr. Watson. This diminishes somewhat the impact of Holmes' display of emotions, which were only few in the canon, and they make his relationship to Watson seem a little less profound compared to the literary duo, because a certain sense of uniqueness is lost. Nevertheless, it should not be said that Downey's Holmes does not have his fair share of emotional moments regarding the good doctor. Whenever Watson's impending departure comes up because he's getting married, Holmes often seems uneasy or outright sad. We will take a closer look at those specific moments shortly. For now, it is enough to point out that Holmes does not hide his disappointment, even when Watson is the cause of it. Holmes and Watson's friendship in the first movie bears an interesting overall connotation. Since the first film has Watson moving out of Baker Street because of his engagement to Mary Morstan, Sherlock Holmes becomes jealous, angry, and disappointed, mimicking a behavior that is clearly representative of the jilted lover. While canon Holmes does refer to Watson's marriage as selfish at one point, there is never the extreme sense of jealousy which Downey's Holmes displays. At this point in their friendship, they have reached a stage where Holmes feels he needs Watson at his side, but of course will not say as such, and Watson is trying not to want to be there. Movie Holmes is very outspoken, even manipulative to a certain degree when it comes to his influence on Watson's private life. While Holmes' literary counterpart does not initially approve of the marriage, it is never because of Mary, but because of his dislike of the idea of marriage in general. It will become clear that while Holmes in the movies does eventually respect Watson's decisions, there are also obvious disapproval and direct moves against Watson's relationship, coming from Holmes' personal envy, a sentimentality which is absent from the original books. One might be tempted to describe Holmes and Watson's friendship in the first movie as one undergoing the development of a classic romantic relationship in mainstream blockbuster movies. Their partnership is all wonderful and, to Holmes, perfect as it is, and as soon as another person, a potential quote-unquote romantic rival, enters the scene, Mary Morstan in this case, the relationship experiences serious problems. This picture of their relationship becomes quite obvious early on when Watson, in an attempt to lure Holmes out of the house, invites the detective for dinner. And Holmes agrees, but as soon as Watson adds that Mary will be joining them, an expression of panic hurries across Holmes' face before he says he's not available.
So you're free this evening?
Absolutely.
Dinner?
Wonderful.
The Royale?
My favourite.
Mary's coming.
Not available.
You're meeting her, Holmes?
There clearly is an existing discomfort regarding Holmes' perception of Mary Morstan, which seems odd when compared to the canon since he is originally fully aware of who the woman is. So once again, Guy Ritchie changes the relationship between original characters in order to create a conflict or further emotions that were absent from the original books. The central conflict to Holmes and Watson's friendship is even directly called out by the Doctor during his dinner invitation when he says,
It's happening, whether you like it or not. 8:30, the Royale. Wear a jacket.
You wear a jacket.
Downey's detective does not want his relationship with Watson unsettled, which makes him the very embodiment of homosocial desires, the seeking, enjoyment and or preference for the company of the same sex. Holmes seeks to live in his established relationship with another man, unwilling to let it be disrupted by social norms, women or other potential intruders. In prioritizing his relationship to Watson over anything else, Holmes sets himself apart from the general understandings of 19th century relationships. While his devotion to a primarily patriarchal Victorian social order, meaning the interest of men, is established, his desire for a bond with a particular man, meaning an interest in men, dominates. Holmes's desire for Watson's friendship takes on an alarming level of manipulation, which seeks to make Mary seem like a dislikable person for Watson. During their first meeting, Holmes takes his deductions knowingly too far, telling Watson about Mary's previous marriage.
However, the jewels you are not wearing tell us rather more.
Holmes.
You were engaged. The ring has gone, but the lighter skin where it once sat suggests that you spent some time abroad wearing it proudly.
The movie is also larded with multiple verbal implications alone. Despite Watson's continued negations, Holmes continues to refer to the two of them as a pair whenever he talks about taking on his investigations.
Watson, grab a compass. You means us.
No, you means you.
Following that, he even goes on to talk Watson into coming with them, using Mary and Watson's integrity as a doctor in order to manipulate him into forgetting about an appointment with his wife.
Taking this seriously, are you, Holmes?
Yes, as you should. It's a matter of professional integrity. No girl wants to marry a doctor who can't tell if the man's dead or not.
Holmes even openly admits to his manipulations later on after having hired a fortune teller who was meant to make marriage seem like a bad idea to Watson.
My money.
You are terrified of a life without the thrill of the macabre.
Do you have my
Admit it, admit it.
Give me my money!
Holmes.
This development of Holmes and Watson's friendship finds its eventual breakup not much later. After the two men get involved in a fight, they are sent to prison and have to spend the night there. When Holmes wakes up, the doctor is obviously in a bad mood as he goes through his old notes. He concludes,
I've been reviewing my notes on our exploits over the last 7 months. Would you like to know my conclusion? I am psychologically disturbed.
It becomes obvious that while Watson says that he is not complaining, he indeed has had problems with Holmes' behavior over the years. As we know, Watson's literary counterpart, while occasionally wondering about Holmes' methods, has never taken any serious issues with them. In the canon, Watson's complaints, if he ever really complains, are usually short-lived and often even disregarded by the end of the story. Guy Ritchie's first movie gives Watson those very particular doubts in order to have an emotional breaking point for the main characters, something akin to a breakup in a story of romances, in which things seem to be fine until they're not. The two leads need to distance themselves in order to later have an emotional reunion. The rift in their friendship also serves as a character development for Holmes, who has to lose the only person he's always had in his life so he can become a better person further down the line. The breakup reaches its climax when Watson finally calls out his friend on his manipulations.
What I do take issue is your campaign to sabotage my relationship with Mary.
Knowing it is true, Holmes tries to distract from the accusation. However, the doctor finally has enough of Holmes and hisses at him.
What? Invited? Why would I not be invited to my own brother's country home? Watson, now you're not making any sense.
You're not human!
John Watson!
You can see the shocked yet clear expression of both men here. Seeing that Holmes is both sad and disappointed, but Watson seems surprised by his own harshness but nevertheless stands by his words. At this point, Holmes has completely lost Watson as a companion, and this becomes even more evident when Watson is taken out of prison. Out of all people, it is of course Mary Mawson who comes to pick him up, and Holmes has to watch Watson literally leaving him for his fiancée. And thus the fear the detective has had throughout the entire movie has become a reality. After that crucial scene, Holmes has to mend his relationship with Watson. When the two men are eventually reunited back at Baker Street, there is still a sense of weight from their previous conversation. However, typical of the iconic duo, they are quickly able to come back to friendly terms, when Holmes, noticing Watson is still interested in the investigation, plays a little dumb so he can draw Watson in. Holmes even leaves his revolver in Baker Street on purpose, so Watson, who knows what Holmes is up to, is forced to follow him. One might say that this once again is a manipulative act coming from Holmes. However, in this case, it is out of a true desire to have Watson at his side in order to make up for his recent behavior. This brings us to the scene at the docks, where an explosion occurs and has Watson risking his own life in order to save Holmes. The explosion is the final event which fully brings together the two friends as Watson is critically injured and Holmes attends to his wounds. Typical of relationships in blockbuster movies, a fateful event usually reunites the two previous split lovers/friends and makes them realize how much they truly need and care for each other. This is further emphasized by the fact that Holmes is not alone when he looks after Watson, but also encounters Mary Morstan. Despite his previous treatment of her, she's not angry with him. In fact, she even acknowledges the one thing that they both have in common, their love for Watson.
I know that you care for him as much as I do. This is not your responsibility, it was his choice.
This bears quite the significance within Holmes's emotional journey regarding his friendship with Watson, since the love for his best friend is called up by the one person he has discarded as the one taking that very friend away from him. So, if even Mary Morstan is able to see and acknowledge the deep bond these two men share, there we have the first time Holmes might consider that he does not lose Watson through his marriage, but instead shares him with someone who loves him just as equally. When Holmes and Watson fully reunite after the explosion, the detective has gone through a hellish night and is met by Watson and Irene Adler, who were looking after him. While the emotional acknowledgement of Adler is rather easy for Holmes, his address to Watson seems unsure and almost a little embarrassing. There is this odd sense of two old quote-unquote lovers meeting again, and it is clearly difficult for Holmes to utter a direct word of affection or gratitude towards Watson as both men try to reconnect.
Well, I'm just so very glad that you're, with us.
Physically, they are as close as possible, sitting next to each other on Holmes's bed. However, both of them seem almost a little uncomfortable with the notion of sharing honest and open affection. While Holmes is able to do just that when he is with Irene Adler, the love between Holmes and Watson is never verbally affirmed by either man. This seems odd, especially since their relationship is the centerpiece of the movie, and if we take a look at their literary counterparts, we see that those two have no problem admitting their bond, even in front of others. In general, there seems to be an avoidance of an open acknowledgement of feelings between Holmes and Watson, which might be due to Guy Ritchie's contemporary reworking of the detective, since it seems that original Holmes is allowed to show emotion much more than modern detectives. There is a clear lack of verbal and physical affirmation when compared to Holmes' relationship with his other on-screen partner, Irene Adler. With her, he shares not only physical intimacy, but also verbal chemistry, which means that the movie follows a certain sense of heteronormativity, since it depicts open intimacy between Holmes and the leading lady, but refuses to have the two men, the arguably main couple, openly acknowledge their affection and gratitude and sense of friendship with one another in a way that is unmistakably serious. The climax of the first movie involves Holmes, Watson, Adler fighting off goons, but deliberately separates Watson from the other two, who go on to share the final showdown with the main antagonist. Goes to show that the story seems to see its emotional center with the couple Holmes-Adler and not with the two men. The obvious romantic subplot finds its conclusion in the climax of the movie. Nevertheless, the last notes of the story are left for Holmes and Watson. In the last scene of the movie, back at Baker Street, Holmes seems to have finally come to accept the marriage between Watson and Mary, since he's even the one who has provided the couple with their engagement ring.
I think he's finally come to terms with you leaving.
Mary, look at the ring he's given us.
When it is finally time for the two men to part ways, there is an unmistakable sense of uncomfortable sadness between the two. Both are not taking this very easily, sharing looks of uncertainty, and there's the anticipation of one final moment of shared affection, since it will be the last time Holmes and Watson will see each other for some time. However, the movie decides to end on a humorous note, which sends Watson out of Baker Street before either man can say something, thus leaving a moment of honesty and love, once again, unused. Holmes and Watson's friendship goes through a rather classic love story portrayed in the mainstream blockbuster movies, and while their bond remains the most important relationship of the movie, their intimacy is different compared to both Holmes' relationship with Irene Adler and the two men's literary counterparts. Obviously, film is a different medium compared to the original canon, so we do not know Watson's inner thoughts as when we read the stories. But as already pointed out, the friendship in the books is one of absolute loyalty and mutual admiration, one that as good as never goes through any problems. Watson is the one with whom Holmes feels comfortable to be 100% himself. In the canon, the Doctor is the only one Holmes needs in his life, the one who humanizes him. Guy Ritchie not only sees the need to put in a conventional romance with Irene Adler in order to make Sherlock Holmes seem more warm-hearted and relatable, but it also eliminates a certain uniqueness of Holmes' friendship with Watson found in the original books. While the first movie still has its fair share of emotional intimacy between Holmes and Watson, the second movie not only continues that, but also adds a level of physical closeness as well. However, there are also some other variables carried over from the first movie. Those include Holmes' continued campaign against marriage and the question if Watson is truly happy outside of his adventures with Holmes. One has to say though, where the first movie did show some lack of emotional acknowledgement between the two men, Guy Ritchie's second adaptation gives some more weight to the special bond shared by the two friends. The second movie finally includes Watson's marriage, an event Holmes does still not seem particularly fond of. When Watson picks him up for the stag party, Holmes doesn't seem keen on the topic of marriage, prompting a discussion in which he lists all the downsides of being in a committed relationship, while Watson tries to see the positives.
Marriage. It's the end, I tell you.
I think of it as the beginning.
Armageddon.
Rebirth.
Restriction.
Structure.
Answering to a woman.
This discussion ends with a humorous but nevertheless slightly upsetting conclusion.
So we'll have a good old-fashioned romp tonight. You'll settle down, have a family, and I'll die alone.
Yes, that's about it.
And this once again stresses the idea of Holmes, or anyone really, having to be in a loving relationship in order to have a happy life. It dismisses the aromantic nature of the detective, whose canon counterpart was perfectly content with only Watson's friendship, while not showing any interest or desire for a romantic relationship. Thus, it is not surprising that Holmes deems the idea of marriage an unfavourable one. However, it does seem almost demeaning that he keeps verbally intruding Watson's private life, apparently still intent on keeping him from leaving. Still, despite all the talk, Holmes shows how much he cares about his friend when he makes sure that Watson gets to his wedding on time, at which he is the Doctor's best man. There remains a touch of sadness though when we see Holmes separated from the happy couple, unable to really look at them and eventually deciding to leave. Nevertheless, Holmes' occasional jabs at Watson's married life continue, as he keeps making insinuating comments that are intent on making Watson realize that he's better off with Holmes. After an attack on Watson and Mary, Holmes blames their marriage plans, implying that the Doctor got himself into danger and needs Holmes in order to stay safe.
Had you and Mary not been so hell-bent on your wedding, we could have already solved this case.
There it is.
All
No, it's
I'm
my fault
saying
now.
is the argument could be made.
No, it couldn't.
That
Later on, Holmes even goes so far as to outright ask Watson,
Be happy. At this moment, are you as happy as you would be on your honeymoon in Brighton?
Despite them being in this dangerous situation, Holmes still goes out of his way to make an implication that seems to tell Watson that he would lead a much happier and more satisfying life adventuring with Holmes than being married to Mary Morstan. The movie seems to comply with Holmes' mindset, writing Mary Morstan out of the story fairly early after the wedding, and thus making sure that the detective and the Doctor stay together as the primary couple of the movie. The separation occurs during an action-filled scene aboard a train that we will take a closer look at, since it is during those moments that the movie openly leans into not only a more physical side to Holmes and Watson's friendship, but also one that very openly plays with homosexual connotations. A queer view of the train sequence, and in fact both movies, is almost inevitable, given the fact that Holmes already enters the scene dressed in drag. Watson seems startled by both Holmes' presence and look, and already during their first encounter, the two men are framed closely as they both assess each other. Holmes' plan of rescue is to throw Mary out of the train in a nearby river, where she is picked up by Mycroft Holmes, Sherlock's older brother. When Watson realizes what Holmes has done, he becomes absolutely furious and launches himself at Holmes. The positions as they are fighting are unmistakably sexual, given the fact that Watson lies atop of Holmes, who even proceeds to take him between his legs. However, the fight does not stop there. In fact, the movie decides to even go a step further and have Watson rip off Holmes' shirt, revealing his naked chest. All the while, the two men are still atop of each other as they are lying on their carriage seats. The movie clearly leans into a homoerotic undertone in those couple of seconds, since the position of the two men are very suggestive and even overemphasized as the fight goes on. Yet the train sequence does not stop there with its innuendos. As the two men continue being attacked, they make their way to another carriage. Once they are there, Watson is startled yet again as he finds Holmes on the floor, and the detective proposes,
Lie down with me, Watson.
Why?
I insist.
Clearly, Watson finds this proposal irritating, and yet he complies. So there we have Watson lying next to a half-naked Holmes in a narrow compartment, and they are pressed against each other closely as they get into the line of fire and huddle together in order to stay protected. The entire train sequence is drained in moments of homoerotic connotation, and while they are either played off as something humorous or nothing at all, there's almost no fault in assuming that the intended meaning is supposed to be gay. Even after the physical implications of that action scene, the train sequence concludes with a final conversation between Holmes and Watson as they discuss their further actions. Referencing Watson's failed honeymoon plans, Holmes enthusiastically suggests that they should go to
Paris, the most sensible honeymoon destination of all.
with which he is implying that it is the two men and not Watson and his wife going on honeymoon. Added to that comes also another line of dialogue shortly before, when Holmes titles their friendship Our Relationship, and Watson is irritated by the choice of words, prompting Holmes to a little unwillingly correct himself.
Relationship.
Very well, partnership has not yet run its course.
Given the fact that the word relationship can be given multiple meanings, including a romantic connotation, Watson's confusion seems to stem from just that double meaning. The movie obviously intends there to be a double-sided implication to Holmes and Watson's friendship, since it basically calls itself out with that short line of dialogue. Another scene of a similar connotation occurs towards the end of the movie, when the main characters arrive at the conference in Switzerland and attend a festive dance. As already mentioned earlier, Holmes goes on to dance with Madame Simsa, a moment which is treated with seriousness. After that, Holmes proposes to dance with Watson, who looks at the detective's hand with a grin and then sarcastically says,
I thought you'd never ask.
Once again, we have the homo-romantic subtext, but also the humorous nature that goes along with those kinds of moments between Holmes and Watson. While this adds to the love and even romantic side of their partnership, it also diminishes its effect, since it treats the dance between the two men less seriously as a dance between the man and the woman. Nevertheless, the scene indulges the gay connotation even further, as the dance ends with Holmes asking,
By the way, who taught you how to dance?
You did.
Well,
while the friendship of the literary Holmes and Watson has been described as such as well, it is the chemistry between Downey's Sherlock and Law's John that has more frequently been titled as bromantic. The expression has become quite popular in recent years, denoting a close brotherly bond between two men, however one that does not quite surpass the line of homosexuality. Whereas many male friendships in contemporary blockbuster movies would usually be undercut by a romantic subplot, which Guy Ritchie's films admittedly also do to a certain degree, and the closest relationship a man could have is the one with his potential female lover, Holmes and Watson share an intimacy that seems to be above average Hollywood stereotypes. Guy Ritchie and his scriptwriters were clearly aware of the homosexual innuendos they were playing with, since the first movie not only makes Holmes the jealous quote-unquote lover, but also uses throwaway lines with unquestionable implications, such as the scene where Holmes takes off Watson's belt with the words,
don't get excited. Turn off that valve.
As previously mentioned, the homosocial aspect of the men's relationship plays an important role in both films, emphasizing the desire Holmes and Watson have for each other's company, while at the same time trying to establish a heteronormative construct that depends simultaneously upon the use and exclusion of women and fear homosexuality. This is why we see the two purposes Irene Adler and Mary Morstan serve in Ritchie's movies. One, by their intrusion, they are posing as a threat to Holmes and Watson's relationship, and two, by their own relationships to said men, they are affirming Holmes and Watson's more conventional heterosexuality. Even though they seem to exclude one another, the women's roles in Ritchie's adaptations are clearly meant to emphasize the bond between Holmes and Watson. While Holmes is the one who openly commits to his homosocial desires, the movies both deny and confirm a similar need within Watson's character. He wants to marry Mary Morstan and settle down, but at the same time he continuously finds himself wanting to go along with Holmes, even when it means abandoning his wife. Neither man ever openly acknowledges the deep bond between them, as they find it hard to ever be outright emotional with one another, and yet they easily banter using innuendo-laden language. Holmes and Watson are closeted and uncloseted in their inevitable need for one another, all the while social conventions and their female partners are constantly lurking in the background. Despite the movie makers' obvious wish to engage with those homosexual connotations, they also knowingly play them off in order to still remain on the safe side with Hollywood blockbuster conventions. In a mindset that resembles the conventional phrase of no homo, the relationship between Downey's Holmes and Lois Watson may be acknowledged, but it's likely to be undercut by humor. As previously pointed out, there are multiple scenes in Ritchie's movies in which the emotional gravity of a moment between the two men is depicted as something less serious than the connection between the male and female characters. Ritchie's movies attempt to address the homosexual nature of Holmes and Watson's friendship, since a 21st century audience might be more inclined to see a possible romantic connection between the two bachelors living together for many years. There are many possibilities to allude to the audience's fantasy. However, at the same time, Ritchie is unwilling to fully commit either men to their undeniable feelings for one another, and this leaves open a wide space for interpretation in which every viewer can imagine the detective and the doctor in whichever relationship they see fit. The homo-romantic undertones of Holmes and Watson's friendship are also cleverly implied through the use of all the movie's characters and the actors portraying them. This becomes evident even through secondary characters such as Mycroft Holmes, who says to Mary Morstan at one point,
Although our time together has been but a brief interlude, I'm beginning to understand how a man might grow to enjoy the company of a person of your gender.
Given the fact that Mycroft is played by openly gay actor Stephen Fry, there does seem to be not only a homosexual connotation, but also a connection, since one might think that because one of the Holmes brothers is not heterosexual, the other one might not be as well. Stephen Fry himself even acknowledged the gay subtext which has been put into the movie, saying,
You know, some people have said, he and Holmes are gay, and of course there's some quite funny little, not exactly allusions to that in Guy's films, but it kind of skates on the knowing surface of that quite well, I think.
However, it is the acknowledgement coming from Robert Downey Jr., and partly Jude Law, that fully cements the homosexual connotations of his detective and Law's doctor. The actors clearly share a good relationship too, and they know how to emphasize their on-camera chemistry and off-camera friendship to help sell the film. Drawing parallels to their literary counterparts, Downey emphasizes the legitimacy of intimacy the audience sees on screen by saying,
I feel about Jude the way Sherlock feels about John. He's the best partner a guy could ask for.
Downey seems to fully revel in the idea of Holmes and Watson possibly being gay. When the first movie came out in 2009, Robert Downey Jr. was not shy in his phrasing when he provoked controversy by saying that Holmes and Watson were two men who happened to be roommates who wrestle a lot and share a bed. The actor is very obviously willing to use the attention that would come from a queer undertone, since he even changed certain aspects of the movie in order to receive such a reaction. For example, the train sequence originally had Holmes disguised as a priest, but Downey came up with the idea of dressing in drag. Even though Downey denounces the idea of bromance, saying bromance is so passé, he uses all of its implications for the promotion and description of Holmes and Watson's friendship. Downey leaves open the possibility for there being more than just friendship between Holmes and Watson, while he also posits that either audiences should or should not perceive and read homoerotic subset in this portrayal, virtually leaving open a space for interpretation yet again. Despite the fact that Guy Ritchie's adaptations are far from being faithful if compared to the canon, the popularity and success of the movies are undeniable. Not only were the movies able to reintroduce Sherlock Holmes to a new generation, they also helped revive the mythos around the character, resulting in many contemporary reimaginings of Doyle's stories. Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock has become the favorite of many Holmes fans, whether they were new to the canon or not, and even several years after the second movie's release, people are still remembering Ritchie's steampunk version of the detective. In fact, a third movie has been planned for many years and is supposed to finally find its way into cinemas in December 2021, with Downey and Law both reprising their roles. Clearly both actors are still in high demand, given Downey's fame in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Law featuring in similarly big franchises such as the Fantastic Beasts series. A sequel that reunites both actors would certainly garner a lot of attention in the media and at the box office. One can only speculate as to the nature of what a third movie in Ritchie's adaptation series would entail. If one were to take a look at the canon, the story of the empty house would obviously come to mind, the adventure famous for featuring Holmes' return after his apparent death. Not only would it lead to another emotionally filled story between Holmes and Watson, it would also increase the homosocial aspect of their relationship, since Mary Morstan, at this point, has been written out of the canon and Watson moves back into Baker Street. Also, given the increasing popularity and demand of movies featuring homosexual characters, the chemistry shared by Downey and Law would most likely be highly celebrated, if not expected even. That changes have to be made to any literary character when it comes to adapting them are almost unavoidable, and Sherlock Holmes is, unfortunately, no exception. While Guy Ritchie had hoped to bring the eccentric yet fascinating nature of Sherlock Holmes to the big screen or to reintroduce the detective to a contemporary audience, he has also made sacrifices that resulted in flat-out ignorance of Doyle's original work. Sherlock Holmes is one of the most famous literary heroes, and that such a figure's asexual and aromantic characteristics represent a sexuality that is otherwise rarely ever seen in any fictional works probably means a lot for those asexual viewers yearning for representation. Guy Ritchie has chosen to eliminate a part of Holmes' personality that not only meant representation for a minority, but has otherwise been perfectly in line with the detective's otherness that made him so special. The unrelatable nature of Sherlock Holmes is what makes him such a fascinating character, because he's meant to be exotic in his own way and different from the social norms surrounding him. Ritchie might have made the detective accessible, but his personality changes also made him closer to any run-of-the-mill detective character, so that in Ritchie's movies there's virtually no need for this to be Sherlock Holmes, for the job could have been done by any other hero. Hello, John here. I would just like to point out, I know this analysis sounded a bit negative, but I would like to point out I love these films a lot. Like, these films introduced me to the Sherlock Holmes canon, so I'm quite thankful for what Guy Ritchie and Robert Downey Jr. and all the other people have done. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.